What if Deku became a teacher? Hey everyone! Welcome back to Nothing But Anime. This is part 9th of the What If Deku Became a Teacher series. If you're enjoying the video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more awesome content. Now let's dive right in. The next morning was fairly easy on Izuku as he woke up to his mom making breakfast for the two of them, and after eating Izuku shooed his mom off to her job insisting he could clean everything up on his own. The heartwarming feeling hadn't fully left with his mom, but she had taken a good chunk of it. The apartment just felt emptier without his mom there. So he quickly cleaned up to get straight into his college work before heading off to Niigata. Izuku was excited to return to the south side and already lined up somewhere to stay with one of his students. He was really looking forward to seeing the kids there again, and was expecting some kind of warm greeting given his relationship with them. He decided to leave his car at the apartment since he could get around much easier with the public transit system and would be back in Shizuoka in 2 days. He also wouldn't need as much stuff, so taking the car would only be more of a hassle. Izuku rode on the train to the south side, and admittedly the overlooming danger of All for One had returned to the forefront of his mind. He tried to think through a rational plan to do with this knowledge. The first was what he wanted to do with the information. Did he want this terrible person gone? Yes, but Izuku wasn't an idiot who would try to take on the Quirk-era boogeyman, so he'd just have to avoid him for now and figure out where he was more actively involved. The more he thought of it, the more it sunk in that there was nothing he could actually do with this information. Even if he didn't say anything about what Yuri-san told him and just what he found independently, he would be laughed out of any police station or hero agency he had the nerve to go to. And regardless of whether or not anyone would take him seriously, Yuri-san warned him that All for One kept his many eyes and ears out for anyone that goes around throwing his name. So considering what Zuki said about quirkless people already disappeared around All for One, Izuku didn't think it would be wise for him to poke the bear. But he also didn't want to just let this go on, even if he couldn't do anything about it right now. Once he had a way to deal with All for One that didn't involve probably never being seen or heard from again, he could address it. Until then, he'd just have to tiptoe around him, no matter how much he didn't like it. All for One aside, Izuku's thoughts trailed off as he got off the train and walked from the station to south side. He was just about to enter the boundaries when he was tackled. He flailed, almost falling over before his body went rigid. Deku-Sensei, Midoriya-chan. 2 squealing cries came from his sides, and he understood what happened. Masao-san walked over shortly after, and he removed both Kikuku-kun and Kaori-chan from his waist. I apologize, Midoriya-san. They wanted to welcome you back personally, Masao-san told him, and Kaori-chan pouted at him. Don't act like you didn't miss him, Ani-chan, she said, pointing an accusing finger at him. Masao-san side-eyed her. I didn't say I didn't, just that I don't lack the self-restraint to jump him, he corrected, and Kikuku-kun had the decency to look ashamed. I'm sorry for using my quirk on you, Deku-Sensei. He apologized, letting his head hang. It's no PP problem, Izuku told him through forced uncooperative vocal cords as most of his body was still locked up. Masao-san put both kids down and moved to pick Izuku up. Everyone is waiting to see you at the community center. Akiko-san made cake, he explained as he carried him off, and Izuku would have beamed if he could move his lips. Akiko-san made great cakes. Mizo was tired as he walked home from the station, making sure to pull up his mask so that it still covered his face. He was also trying to ignore the looks he got from just about everyone, even if he always got looks like this. Today was just worse than usual. It seemed like everyone he would normally run into when he went to school would give him that look. His classmates hadn't bothered to pretend to be quiet when they were talking about him. The teachers didn't address what his classmates were saying either. His history teacher gave them a pop quiz, and Mizo could swear the school bells were getting louder by the day, and that was starting to hurt his ears. And on the train back were 2 women all too happy to talk about him and everything they thought was wrong with his generation, or more specifically him. Mizo was never happier to get off the train before and planned to get home to do his homework. Honestly, moving to the south side hadn't been as much of a hassle he thought it would be. Sure, he had to be a bit more vigilant about stumbling into something dangerous because there were more gangs in the area, but at least he didn't get as openly gawked at. Their new apartment was also much better than their old place. Mizo even had his own room, and the apartment's heating actually worked as it was supposed to. Mom also seemed much happier with her new job, even if she was working more. He hadn't heard any complaints from anyone, at least. Mizo was a bit surprised that the people he'd normally see aren't there today, but he just tried to brush it off. He wasn't going to see the same people on the street every day, and they clearly had lives of their own. So he just took advantage of the calm to get home in one piece, hopefully without having to take a detour. Mizo had just gotten to the complex, and perhaps he wasn't as aware as he should have been because someone ran into him. Not hard, but the other person was carrying a box that would have hit the floor if he didn't catch it with a secondary pair of hands. Oh no. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to run into you. Are you okay? The person asked, and Mizo turned to them only to freeze. Mom had always made a point of telling him what their landlord looked like so that he didn't get them accidentally kicked out, or their rent doubled, so one could imagine the dread he felt when he realized that the person that ran into him was their landlord and his mom's boss. Midoriya-san was exactly as she described and seemed more interested in apologizing to him than the fact Mizo was also holding him up in one of his secondary arms. Mizo quickly righted himself, letting go of Midoriya-san and giving the box he was holding back. I'm fine. I apologize for bumping into you, Midoriya-san. He told him, mentally praying he hadn't just screwed up the best thing to have happened to them since ever. Midoriya-san blinked, taken aback. No. It's my fault really. I was the one that bumped into you. I should have been watching where I was going. He assured, then glanced at the secondary arm he used to form a mouth before he brightened up with a soft gasp. Oh my gosh, is that your quirk? That's so cool. It must have taken you a lot of work to learn how to do that. Can you make other body parts? Like ears or eyes? Are you limited to replicating your own body parts, or can you make the limbs of other animals? Can you make more limbs, or are you limited to just the 8 you have now? Midoriya-san began rambling. There were practically stars in his eyes as a torrent of questions spilled from his mouth. Leaving Mizo to be shocked, was Midoriya-san actually interested in what he could do with his quirk? He wasn't creeped out by the mouth he made with his hand? Just when Mizo thought Midoriya-san would never run out of questions for him about his quirk, the greenette slapped his hand over his mouth. Midoriya-san had taken a 180, becoming very meek and slightly pale. So sorry. That was so inappropriate of me. I shouldn't have said any of that. I know how cc creepy and invasive it is to ask about your Q quirk. An apology springing forth from him, his hands flying everywhere as he did, and Mizo had to catch the box again. They were both silent for a second as Midoriya-san refused to meet his eyes, covering his face with his arms. It's not creepy. Mizo tried to reassure him, but honestly, he was still caught up in the whiplash of Midoriya-san's change in demeanor. Midoriya-san's eyes shot wide open. Really? Midoriya-san asked, whispering so quietly Mizo only heard it because of his enhanced hearing. And Mizo hesitated because the one question about what would happen if one of his secondary limbs got cut off was a tad bit creepy. But Midoriya-san's questions hadn't been offensive in any way he could think of. Mizo was more flustered by the attention than creeped out. Really? He confirmed with a nod, and he could see the second Midoriya-san was hit by relief. Thank God, the greenette muttered under his breath, a finger lightly scratching his cheek. Here, Mizo said, offering the box back, and Midoriya-san's face turned a tad red as he took it back. All right. Thank you, he replied, still very bashful. Why, you're Shoji-san's son? Mizo-kun, right? Midoriya-san asked sheepishly, and Mizo nodded. Masao-san mentioned you. He said you both go to Shiritsu. The greenette explained, having regained some confidence. Yes, Miyake-senpai is hard to miss. Reptile mutation aside, Miyake-senpai is the only person I've met my age that was taller than me, Mizo mused in his head. Meeting him had been rather surreal as he had become used to towering over most people at 5'9" feet. This is embarrassing. I am sorry for not introducing myself to you earlier. I've been kind of busy. Midoriya-san apologized again. I've heard. Mizo commented, recalling multiple times overhearing his neighbors talking about him leaving to travel. Why yeah. But I still shouldn't have bombarded you with questions about your quirk. Midoriya-san added with an awkward chuckle. Mizo frowned when he said that because while he hadn't expected it, Midoriya's questions weren't fully unwelcome. He had honestly thought he knew what his quirk did pretty well. He could grow multiple limbs from his 6 arms and transform the ends into hands, facial features to enhance one of his senses, or even another head if he wanted, but he couldn't even answer half of Midoriya-san's questions if he wanted to. It's alright, I just don't know the answer to most of your questions, he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. His previous counselors certainly hadn't asked him to try much of anything after seeing him form other copies of his own features. His quirk had always just freaked them out too much, and he admittedly wasn't that invested in exploring his quirk's boundaries in retrospect. Part of Mizo was disappointed that he didn't know as much as he previously believed about the quirk he's had since birth. A lot of the questions Midoriya-san had asked were kind of vital to know, like what would happen if a secondary arm got cut off. Mizo was now somewhat worried if such a loss would be permanent. Midoriya-san didn't seem disappointed by his confession. Oh well, it wouldn't be too difficult to test most of that. Honestly, I think you've figured out the most difficult parts if you can communicate so flawlessly with the mouths you made. He softly encouraged, and Mizo felt touched by the greenette's acknowledgement of the work he put into making his secondary mouths functional. It had taken him years to perfect the temporary vocal cords. I'd probably suggest you start by seeing if you mimic someone's voice, since you've had practice making vocal cords to mimic your own voice, or seeing if you can push the boundaries of the features you replicate by trying to extend the tongue in your hand-mouth by a few inches. It's a great starting point since it's a soft muscle instead of shifting hard bone matter. Midoriya-san recommended, and Mizo had half a mind to try that. Mimicking someone else's voice sounded like something that would be incredibly useful for a hero, and there were a lot of people who could imitate other people's voices without any aid of a quirk. Voice acting was a whole career and everything, but Mizo hadn't made the connection to building his temporary vocal cords to imitation at all. That sounds like a good idea, Midoriya-san. I'll have to try that. You seem to know a lot about quirks. Do you have an analysis quirk of some kind? Mizo told him, finding himself a bit curious since he would have been sure Mom would have mentioned that. Midoriya-san's face got red, and he awkwardly chuckled again. No, and nothing like that. Quirk analysis is just a hobby I've had since I was young. I'm in college for it actually, but I am really flattered you think I'm anywhere near that smart. He bashfully explained, trying to brush the compliment off. Mizo blinked, surprised. You're in college? He asked. He didn't know people without intelligence quirks were allowed to start college at their age. Midoriya-san got more flustered. Well, it's online courses, so I don't have to go to a campus except F4 when I take my F-finals to finish the course and graduate. Midoriya-san elaborated. Not that it put a dent in Mizo's awe because online or not, that was very impressive to manage at their age on top of owning property. Going back to your quirk, you don't have to tell me anything about your quirk, Mizo-kun, or try anything I mention. We hardly know each other, and I don't expect you to tell me anything private like T. Midoriya-san insisted, shyly ducking his head, still a touch red-faced. Mizo stood staring at Midoriya-san. He wasn't sure if he was the best judge of character, but nothing about Midoriya-san had sent him any red flags other than the brief dismemberment question. So after a moment of consideration, he couldn't quite see a downside to talking about his quirk with Midoriya-san. He probably learned more about his quirk in the past few minutes with the greenette than years of counseling sessions. I don't mind talking about quirks with you, Midoriya-san, Mizo told him. Midoriya-san's mouth fell open and he stared back, Mizo blinking multiple times. Why you don't? He asked in a voice hardly above a whisper. Mizo nodded. Not at all, Midoriya-san. You had some interesting ideas I want to try out, Mizo admitted, and he regretted it for a second as tears built up in the corners of Midoriya-san's eyes. The greenette was overwhelming him with his sheer joy, and his positively was infectious as he thanked Mizo. D over everything Mizo told him about his quirk after he stopped, and it was all completely sincere. Mizo had slipped near the end and had mentioned he had plans to become a hero, making the boy gasp. Mizo-kun, you would be an amazing hero, Midoriya-san exclaimed. Stars in his eyes as he went on to point out practically 100 reasons why Mizo would be great in heroics. The greenette seemed to explode in his happiness, and Mizo could hardly make out what he was saying because of how fast Midoriya-san was speaking. Thankfully for Mizo, Midoriya-san calmed down but was still incredibly excited to discuss ways to use his quirk as he walked Mizo to his unit. Izuku was surprised he and Mizo-kun had gotten along so well when they met, especially after he made an absolute fool of himself by ranting about Mizo-kun's quirk. And while Dupli Arms was incredibly fascinating and perfect for heroics, he really shouldn't have gushed like that in front of Mizo-kun. Izuku wasn't sure why Mizo-kun was entertaining him, but he greatly enjoyed hearing Mizo-kun talk about how he learned to make vocal cords before he could try talking with the mouths. Unfortunately, Izuku had other things to do, so he traded numbers with Mizo-kun before he rushed off to deliver the package. Considering how many times he dropped it, he was very lucky it wasn't fragile. He had spent that night in another unit with the Tanakas, and B had to admit he was relieved that the dog hadn't faced any permanent damage. Taka, as the dog was named, seemed to not hold a grudge against Izuku as the dog warmly welcomed him by licking his face. The dog also decided to curl up with him on the couch, and Izuku was kind of thankful he wasn't alone for the night. Izuku tried not to be too much of a burden for Tanaka-san, making breakfast for her and Kiku-kun before heading off to the station. Despite how early it was, he got stopped a few times to say bye. Settling on the train headed to Aomori, Izuku didn't find himself as distressed as when he traveled from Kumamoto to Kauchi. Thus, he was able to enjoy the countryside like he did the first 2 days when he started this journey. He also could take pictures for his mom and the Bakugas since he wasn't busy driving, and the ferry was so much better this time around when he didn't feel like he was going to throw up with every sway of the boat. Hokkaido was bigger and the cities were more spaced out, so he chose to forego his info binging and only do 3 hours of college today. Izuku would just make up for it tomorrow on Sunday after he got home. The red light districts on the island were probably the best looking given that the people had the rich natural resources around to provide for themselves. He had met a couple more quirkless people along the way, and honestly at this point Izuku was pretty sure the entire Japanese population of quirkless people were completely migratory. Not that he could blame them, since a good deal of them also knew all for one had a preference for making them disappear if they stuck around too long. After he finished teaching and introducing himself in the districts, he hopped on a train to head back to the ferry. Izuku had plans to book an overnight train to be back in Shizuoka by Sunday morning. Taking an overnight train was more cost-efficient in the long run, as there wasn't anything he could get from a hotel that he couldn't also get from an overnight train, and he'd get more time with his mom on Sunday. He'd been lucky to catch the last ferry at the terminal and happily took some pictures, though a part of his brain nagged at him that things were going his way just a bit too much, and that left him a bit anxious. Using his limited data, he quickly double-checked he could make the connection to get to his train. He could easily, so he checked if there were any hero versus villain fights so that he wouldn't be needlessly paying money for a ride that wouldn't happen. When he saw there wasn't, he had a quick glance around at the other passengers. This feeling that something was going to happen was rarely wrong and saved him from Kaken's wrath more than once. A person rarely abandoned their instincts after surviving on them for so long, and as paranoid as it made him sound, he was going to trust those instincts, trusted them so much that by the time he got on the train he was justifiably flinching at any sharp movement in his direction. Well, perhaps justifiable to anyone quirkless? Or that knew of all for one. Izuku settled in his small cabin but couldn't really fall asleep as his nerves kept him too on edge. He was heavily debating whether or not to use up his data to listen to something put himself at ease when there was a knock at his door. Izuku's body tensed, and he hesitated before cautiously approached the door with his taser in hand. He should get Auntie Mitsuchin a gift for getting him it. Timidly he debated not answering when a second more insistent knocking came from his door. Izuku's body was trembling as he reached for the door and cracked it open just enough to see outside, but he was ready to slam it shut if necessary. However, Izuku wasn't faced with some stereotypical mobster but a little girl that couldn't have been older than 6. Izuku's brain stalled as he stared at her. Please let me in. I need to hide. Please help me, mister. Please help me. Please, please. The girl pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Snapping out of his stupor, Izuku yanked open the door and swiftly ushered the girl inside without question, then slammed the door shut and locked it. Izuku was about to ask the girl why she was so frightened when an echoing voice called from the hallway, "Come on, kiddo. Come out wherever you are. Little bitch," causing the girl to bury her face into Izuku's stomach, bawling uncontrollably. Izuku sharply inhaled and wrapped his arms tightly around the girl, forcing her to sit against the door with him, shushing her as quietly as he could once. He heard the man calling for the girl. As he passed by his cabin, Izuku could hear the man pause outside, and Izuku quickly put his hand over the girl's mouth. They both sat holding their breath as they rigidly waited for any sound of the man. After what felt like an eternity, the man cursed and continued to call for the girl as he got further and further from Izuku's cabin. It wasn't until Izuku was absolutely sure he couldn't hear the man's voice before he allowed himself to relax. He sighed, removing his hand from the girl's mouth, and turned to her to get a better look at her. The girl's quirk was fairly obvious as he noted two long floppy ears limply hung from where her ears should be, and they were black like her hair, and she had a small matching fluffy rabbit tail. She was also older than he first thought, probably closer to 10. She was still very frightened as she clung to him, trembling. Izuku gently stroked her hair. "He's gone now. Are you all right?" he softly asked, getting a whimper back. But she nodded. Izuku gently pulled the girl into his arms, then carried her over to his bunk and got out a hanky to help clean up her face, looking the girl over for any injuries as he did, but he didn't see anything other than a hand-shaped bruise that took up a good chunk of her left arm. "What's your name?" Izuku questioned, wanting to put a name to her face. She sniffled. "Yumiko." She told him, hands coming up to rub at her face. "That's a pretty name, Yumiko-chan," he complimented, patting her on the head. "Can you tell what happened, Yumiko-chan?" he requested, not pushing her too hard about telling him. I was on the way to my room when he grabbed me. He dragged me away. I bit his hand, then ran off. Then I knocked at your door and..." Yumiko trailed off, and Izuku quickly placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, Yumiko-chan. Do you have anyone with you? Your parents or a sibling?" he inquired, because he wanted to know if someone was looking for Yumiko now and not when officers came knocking. Yumiko shook her head. "And no, I was supposed to ride the train to visit Sabakan," she told him, and Izuku did notice what he originally thought was a bracelet was an unaccompanied minor bracelet. Izuku felt his guts turn at the thought of Yumiko staying in her cabin alone or returning so soon without anyone to protect her. "Okay. What's your stop, Yumiko-chan?" he prodded, checking what time it was on his phone. "Tokyo." She answered, and Izuku flinched. Tokyo was close to Yokohama, and Izuku had planned on changing trains 2 stations before to be safe. But he wasn't about to abandon Yumiko on a train with a kidnapper. "Okay. I'm Deku-Sensei, Yumiko-chan, and you can stay with me until we get to your stop, all right?" he offered. Yumiko nodded rapidly in response. "Thank you, Deku-Sensei," she said, utterly relieved by his offer. Izuku double-checked the door was secured, then went about helping Yumiko get ready for bed. She hadn't felt safe sleeping alone, so Izuku ended up laying down with her on the bed instead of on the floor next to her. He set an alarm for when they would get near to Tokyo Station, then curled up with Yumiko under the blankets. Making sure to keep himself between her and the door, Yumiko tucked close to his chest. Once they woke up, Izuku walked Yumiko to her cabin, his taser held in a death grip in the hand Yumiko wasn't holding. She got changed and got her bag that was left inside, then returned to Izuku's cabin to wait for the rest of the time to the stop. Izuku carried Yumiko off the train, easily handling both the girl and her bag in one arm. He and Yumiko had to look around for a moment, but the girl quickly spotted her grandmother and pointed her out to him. He saw an elderly woman that wasn't much taller than Yumiko and had a similar quirk, but her rabbit features were a soft pink like her hair, clutching her shirt as her attention was held by a second person with a rabbit quirk. "Sabakan," Yumiko called out to the woman, and both turned to them. The horror on the woman's face melted to relief as Izuku let Yumiko down to run over to her. The two hugged each other tightly, and the woman spoke in a language he knew he's heard but didn't know that much of as she kissed Yumiko all over her face. Izuku had initially walked over to hand over Yumiko's bag, but the person Yumiko's grandmother was talking to had locked a death glare onto him the second he heard Yumiko. And despite the man being barely a meter tall, he had a glare strong enough to make Izuku sure that he'd have no trouble sending Izuku to the hospital. Even if Izuku wasn't as rapidly obsessing over heroes and their debuts, he knew of Mirko, how fast she was rising through the rankings and how easily she could break concrete with a single kick. Yumiko, however, had unintentionally come to his rescue when her grandmother presumably asked what happened. "There was this man that tried to grab me on the train, but I got away and Deku-Sensei saved me. He saved my life," Yumiko exclaimed happily, making Izuku a touch flustered, and his hands began waving rapidly. I didn't do that much. Jay just hid Yumiko-chan in my sea cabin," he quickly corrected. There was a flicker of recognition in the man's eyes once he heard Yumiko say his alias, but Izuku was a bit preoccupied with Yumiko's grandmother taking his hands and thanking him in a thick accent. The man placed a hand on the woman's shoulder, saying something in Italian. Izuku was now pretty sure they were speaking in Italian. The woman nodded and took Yumiko into a nearby cafe, leaving Izuku alone with the other rabbit-quirked person. The man differed from the other two as his ears were fully mobile and upright. He had white hair/fur, So Izuku didn't think he was Yumiko's father. Plus he was in his early 20s max, so you're Deku-Sensei? He said with a knowing tone. His arms crossed as he still stared holes into Izuku. Wait. Izuku timidly responded, we've heard something about a two-toes run-in around the island. He commented, glancing down at his shoes for a second. Izuku wasn't sure if the man knowing of him was a good thing or a bad thing. A bunch of my cousins from Shizuoka have been saying you're not that bad. The man told him as he stepped closer to him. Izuku gulped, twirling his thumbs as he avoided the man's eyes. I just want tea to help PP people. Izuku muttered, his nerves getting the best of him. Well, Deku-Sensei, he said, then jumped at Izuku, making him squeak as the man snatched Yumiko's bag from his hand. The man threw the bag over his shoulder, and he had placed his hand on Izuku's shoulder, making him bend down to his height when he landed. If you ever need anything, just ask around the Vespas for Raijin. The man told him, then walked off to the cafe, leaving Izuku to stare at him, processing what he just said before he sighed. You know, it would be just Izuku's luck to get an in with one of the biggest mafia groups in Japan by rescuing a little girl. Why not? A little girl was how he befriended a Russian kingpin after all. Izuku could deal with this new connection he made on Monday. For now, he was going to focus on getting home and spending a nice Sunday alone with his mom. Izuku greatly enjoyed the Sunday he spent with his mom, cooking meals together and visiting a park, so the two of them could get some fresh air and make some memories together before he left for Hiroshima the next day. The rest of September passed on without much fanfare compared to the first week. Nothing extremely life-altering like befriending any more mafias or gangs or discovering any other ancient evil masterminds walking around. Thankfully, Izuku did notice he saw way more people with rabbit quirks around when he visited the red light districts. In addition to seeing the Vespas around, the people in the districts were a bit more open to his help. Izuku suspected the Vespas had something to do with it, considering Yuri-san said they were mainly information dealers. As he and his mother adjusted to his new schedule, Izuku couldn't say he hated the traveling any more than missing seeing his mom in person daily. His enjoyment of travel and his new work had returned and stayed even as he mastered the backroads and the highways, or when there was the odd detour caused by heroes and or villains. In some ways, this new lifestyle was a bit freeing, and he could definitely see why Auntie Mitsuchin enjoyed it, though on other days Izuku found himself questioning things as he became more involved in the underbelly of Japanese society, and then there were the times where he was in a hotel room trying to go to sleep. It was times like this when he was left with nothing but his mind that Izuku wondered, if all but briefly, if there was something wrong with him. Thinking back to his driving exam, he knew that he should have felt safe in a room filled with cops, and 2 years ago he certainly would have. But the closer he grew to the people in the districts, the less safe he felt interacting with any member of the police. There were times he had been pulled over by a cop as he drove between prefectures, and each time Izuku would be coldly held in rigid panic, praying he wouldn't be taken in for being so young despite having a license. All throughout September, Izuku has seen how the police treat people in the red light districts. Not every officer was so crude to the people living in the districts, but there were enough that were to reinforce his newly growing paranoia surrounding the police. Other times he'd wonder if something was wrong with him, specifically for being able to just pick up everything and leave his mom alone in their apartment as he had. The moments of self-deprecation were thankfully few and far in between, as Izuku was usually tired from his work that day and never seemed to happen when he was home with his mom. However, with all of that being said, Izuku wasn't completely anxiety-free, because despite how much he was working, he was fast approaching his college finals. Much like with his middle school work, Izuku had somehow burnt through almost all 4 years' worth of work in a little over a year. Izuku was rather flustered when he got the message informing him he just needed to set up a time to take the final exam in person. It was a Sunday, and he had subsequently been showered in praise and congratulations from his mom. He and his mom arranged it for that coming Thursday, and Izuku spent the next 3 days as an anxious mess, suddenly having a full 5 more hours to worry about it with nothing to distract him from his upcoming test. The only reason he didn't end up tearing up his nails or pasting a hole into a hotel room's floor was because of Yuri-san and Mizoku-in. He had already been talking with Yuri-san, and having accepted that he was basically friends with the man, they had expanded past just talking about Yukiko-chan and Anya-san. So Izuku would end up talking with Yuri-san about the things he learned during his coursework and small anecdotes of what he's done in the other districts. As for Mizoku-in, he had texted Izuku thanking him and asked for more advice since he managed the tongue thing. Mizoku-in even sent him a picture of a hand mouth with a tongue as long as a ruler hanging out of it when Izuku asked, so the two of them had called each other to talk it over. Izuku praised him for figuring out how to extend soft muscle past what should normally be a physical limitation. He asked Mizoku-in if it was difficult, and suggested replacing the other teeth in his hand mouths with nothing but canines before trying to extend them. He also sent Mizoku-in a recording of himself saying a nursery rhyme for Mizoku-in to practice mimicking. He and Mizoku-in also talked a bit about other things like favorite heroes, since neither had much to talk about outside of that topic. Izuku tried once or twice to branch out to different things since he felt bad just talking about Mizoku-in's quirk. It was a bit stilted since they were both socially awkward beings apparently. But Izuku was able to find out Mizoku-in had a slight interest in animals. The day before his exams, Mizoku-in even sent him a video of a stray cat he normally saw on the way home. It was adorable and helped Izuku de-stress a good deal before his test. He also got some calls from the Bakugas wishing him luck for his graduation. Izuku got a lot of encouragement from his mom during their call at breakfast the day of the test, and he did his best to not let his nerves get to him. Walking on the college grounds was odd for him as it was surreal to be there, It all sort of hit him then that he was actually in college and might be graduating today. He got a bit more nervous to talk to the staff, mainly because the front desk lady obviously didn't believe him despite giving her everything he could for proof, including the confirmation letter the college had sent to him. "We don't take students that young," she sternly told him, clearly annoyed with his presence ever since she glanced at his shoes. Honestly, Izuku was halfway considering just giving up and finding someone else, but the woman was holding his documents still. He was going to ask her for his papers back when he suddenly felt a pawed hand on his arm. "Hey Midoriya-kun." Izuku was startled of course and turned to see an early 20s-ish guy a foot shorter than him with a rabbit quirk smiling at him. The guy turned his attention to the lady behind the front desk. "Hey wannabe-san, you're not giving my friend here a hard time, are ya?" he asked in the sickly sweet way Izuku had come to recognize from when characters made thinly veiled threats to others in TV shows. The woman paled slightly and handed Izuku back his papers as well, the paper with where he was supposed to go for his finals, the one she claimed she didn't have. "Thanks, wannabe-san," the guy cheerfully said. And he dragged Izuku out of the building with him. "Thank you." He told the guy, "Nah, that was nothing. Just overheard that put Tana giving you a hard time and figured I'd step in." The guy responded, brushing it off as still you didn't have to. Izuku protested and the guy scoffed. "I'd be a pretty crappy person letting the guy who saved my Sorella be bullied by some tart." The guy joked with a chuckle. Izuku didn't know much Italian, but he did know that word. "Oh, you're Yumiko-chan's brother?" he asked. The guy nodded. "Yeah. She hasn't shut up about her little two-toed hero." He answered with a wink, making Izuku flustered. I wasn't just going to let her be kidnapped." He responded, rubbing his neck and avoiding eye contact, feeling his heart twinge at being called that, the feeling oddly bittersweet. He gave an amused huff. "Yeah, most of you two-toes are a bunch of little goody two-shoes." He replied before changing the subject. "You're going to be taking your test with Wheeler-sensei? I know the campus pretty well, so I can take you to wherever you're going," he offered after glancing at the paper, and Izuku nodded, relieved at the idea of a guide through the fairly large campus. "So you're majoring in quirk studies, right?" he inquired, and Izuku nodded again. "Why, you overheard that part too?" Izuku guessed, and the guy smirked back at him. "Yeah, with how many of us there are, we Vespas have eyes and ears everywhere," he confirmed, flicking his left ear in a wide arc. His implications were not lost on the greenette. "I'm guessing that's how you heard my name," Izuku said, rubbing the back of his neck again after he put his documents away. "Yeah, most of us in Shizuoka and Niigata know your name, Deku-Sensei," he responded, the terrifying fact rolling out of his mouth so simply. Arajin said if I ever needed anything to ask for him, but Izuku trailed off, gripping his Masager bag strap with white knuckles. "Yes?" he prodded, clearly intrigued in what he was about to say. "Do you think why you can keep my real name F from getting O out there? I know I see can't hide be behind an alias F forever, but as a T2-toes," Izuku muttered, his eyes locked on his feet, and the other guy huffed, "Sure thing, Deku-sensei, but let's call it a personal favor for helping Yumiko. So, Raijin still owes you, okay?" he told him with another wink. "Thanks," Izuku replied, then saw they were in front of a building. "And here we are. Good luck, Deku-sensei," the guy encouraged with a light slap to his arm before he left Izuku on his own. Izuku took a deep breath, then entered the building and found the room for his test. Thankfully for Izuku, the test was not held by a quirkist, so he just had to deal with his anxiety over the test itself. 2 hours later, when he was being congratulated for completing his degree, Izuku found himself feeling it was anticlimactic as he signed his name on the certificate. Going home, he found himself questioning what to do with his 5 hours of free time since he'd finished college. Part of him thought of spending more time in the districts, but a bigger part of him wanted to go to college again. He'd really come to enjoy teaching, and he couldn't see a downside to getting a teaching license and degree. Being able to teach more efficiently would also be a benefit, since he was sure there were some things that he could use to help others learn better. Izuku would have to discuss this more with his mom to get her opinion. He was trying to remember which courses he could take this time around as he made his way home to safely stash his new quirk theory degree at home. Izuku was also thinking about whether or not he'd need to get a business license for the 5 stores he was getting made. He'd need to ask Auntie Mitsuchin or Uncle Mazakan if he did need a license to own small businesses. Walking into the apartment, he nearly had a heart attack when there was a series of 3 loud pops. Izuku shrieked, jumping back, and he was a seconds away from grabbing his taser when he heard the cheers of "Congratulations!" Caught off guard, he took a minute to look inside. Both his mom and the Bakugas stood there holding party poppers. "Oh, thank God," he mumbled with a sigh, clutching his chest over his racing heart. Auntie Mitsuchin was the first to come over to him and put him in a headlock, roughly ruffling his hair. "There's the little genius," she teasingly said while Izuku squirmed meekly, trying to push her away. "Auntie." He whined, and Auntie Mitsuchin let him go, laughing. Izuku couldn't help chuckling himself as he was pulled into the small surprise party they had set up for his graduation. However, the best part of the day was when he went back to his room at the end of the night and found a small box stashed away in his desk. Inside were 2 small handmade clay figures that vaguely looked like himself and Kaken, both of which carried the familiar faint scent of caramel. Izuku had a very good idea of where they came from, and honestly, this was probably the closest to an olive branch he'd get from Kaken. That didn't stop him from being overwhelmed to the point of tears when he realized that though. The 9th part is officially done. If you missed the earlier episodes, check out the playlist for a catch-up. Big thanks to the author. Show them some love. I'll be back soon. Appreciate all your support.